Welcome back to the world of the Pokemon trading card game. Last time we covered the basics of the game using 30-card starter decks. In this video, we'll go over the rest of the mechanics that are in the Pokemon trading card game that weren't featured in the last video. We'll be covering the following topics: weakness and resistance, retreating, abilities, special conditions and Pokemon Checkup, Pokemon tools and stadium cards, the Lost Zone, and doing damage versus placing damage counters. Let's dive right in. Weakness and resistance. Near the bottom of every Pokemon card is a section for weakness and resistance. Weakness shows the type that the Pokemon is weak to, which means the Pokemon will take double the damage from attacks by Pokemon of that type. For example, this Pikachu is weak to fighting types, so if it's attacked by Hitmonchan's Mach Cross attack, it will take 120 damage instead of 60. Now, resistance means the Pokemon is strong against that type and will take less damage from attacks by that type of Pokemon. For example, this Magnemite is resistant to grass types, so Steeny's Razor Leaf attack will only do 30 damage. Now pay attention to the number next to the energy symbol on resistance. Over the years, the Pokemon Company has changed the amount of damage that resistance reduces. Sometimes it's -20, sometimes it's -30. Retreating. If you want to switch your active Pokemon with one from your bench, you don't have to wait for it to get knocked out, you can just retreat it. Each Pokemon has a retreat cost printed next to the weakness and resistance. To retreat, you have to discard an energy from the active Pokemon for each colorless energy symbol listed in its retreat cost. On the other hand, this Cleffa doesn't have any energy symbols in its retreat cost, so that means it can retreat for free. Now remember, you can only retreat a Pokemon once per turn. Abilities. Now some Pokemon have special abilities that they can use. Abilities are different from attacks and can be used anytime during your turn. Some abilities have specific actions that must be taken in order to use them. For instance, Radiant Greninja's Concealed Cards ability reads, "You must discard an energy card from your hand in order to use this ability. Once during your turn, you may draw 2 cards." So this is an ability that can be triggered anytime during your turn, but only once per turn. Now some abilities are considered always activated as long as the Pokemon is in play. For example, Baxcalibur's Super Cold ability reads, "As often as you like during your turn, you may attach a basic water energy card from your hand to one of your Pokemon." So you don't have to do anything to trigger this ability. Its effect is always on and available to be used anytime during your turn. Special conditions and Pokemon Checkup. Sometimes attacks and abilities can place additional effects on the Pokemon called special conditions. There are 5 special conditions: asleep, burned, confused, paralyzed, and poisoned. Now these can only happen to the active Pokemon. Evolving or retreating it makes it recover from all special conditions. Now 4 of the 5 special conditions have effects that happen during a special phase between turns called Pokemon Checkup. Once the attack is resolved and the turn is over, you take care of special conditions in this order. First, poison. When a Pokemon is poisoned, you place a poison marker on it. Now during Pokemon Checkup, you place 1 damage counter on the poisoned Pokemon. The Pokemon will take this poison damage between each player's turn, not just the turn of the Pokemon's owner. Next, burn. When a Pokemon is burned, you place a burn marker on it. During Pokemon Checkup, you place 2 damage counters on the burned Pokemon, and then flip a coin. If it's heads, the burn is removed. If it's tails, the burn stays on through the next player's turn, and you'll do the check again during the next Pokemon Checkup phase. Third, asleep. When a Pokemon is put to sleep, turn it counterclockwise to the left. A Pokemon that is asleep cannot attack or retreat. During Pokemon Checkup, you flip a coin. If heads, the Pokemon wakes up. If tails, it stays asleep for the next turn. Finally, paralyzed. When a Pokemon is paralyzed, turn it clockwise to the right. Like an asleep Pokemon, a paralyzed Pokemon cannot attack or retreat. However, during its owner's Pokemon Checkup phase, it recovers from the paralysis on its own. The final special condition, Confused, only affects when the Pokémon attacks. To show that it's confused, flip the Pokémon upside down with the top of the card facing towards you. When you declare your attack with a confused Pokémon, you flip a coin. If heads, the attack goes through as normal. But if it's tails, the attack fails, and instead you put 3 damage counters on the confused Pokémon. Now, a Pokémon can be affected by multiple special conditions at once. A Pokémon can be poisoned, burned, and one of the conditions that is shown by turning the card a different direction. For instance, the Pollen Hazard attack of Celebi and Venusaur GX, a personal favorite of mine, causes the defending Pokémon to be burned, confused, and poisoned. Now, if a new special condition that rotates the card is applied, then whichever one happens last is still in effect. In other words, if a confused Pokémon is hit with an effect that paralyzes it, the Pokémon is no longer confused and is only paralyzed. Also, just as a Pokémon recovers from all special conditions when it retreats or evolves, any other effects placed on a Pokémon, like say from Seismitoad's Shaky Wave attack, are also removed in this way. Pokémon Tools and Stadium Cards. In the first video, we only saw items and supporters in action, but there are 2 other types of trainer cards, Pokémon Tools and Stadium Cards. Pokémon Tools are attached to a Pokémon similar to how energies are. You can attach any number of Pokémon Tools during your turn as you want, but a Pokémon can only have 1 tool attached to it at a time. Tools remain attached to the Pokémon unless the effect of a card removes it. Now, Stadium Cards have effects that can apply to both players. Now, like supporters, they can only be played once per turn, but they stay in play once you play them. So when you play a Stadium, it goes face up beside the active Pokémon, facing the direction of the person who played it. Now, there can only be 1 Stadium card in play at a time, so when a new one is played by either player, the old Stadium is discarded. You cannot play a Stadium card if a Stadium with the same name is already in play. The Lost Zone. The Lost Zone is a special area that exists outside of play. Cards that are sent to the Lost Zone are permanently removed from the game and cannot be recovered. When a card is sent to the Lost Zone, place it face up directly above your prize cards. Each player has their own separate Lost Zone, so if a card has a requirement for needing a certain number of cards in the Lost Zone, like this Sableye's Lost Mine attack, you only count the cards in that player's Lost Zone. Doing damage versus placing damage counters. Now, this can be a source of confusion for a lot of new players, so let's break this down. There is a difference between when an attack does damage and when an attack or effect says to put damage counters onto a Pokémon. Let's look at a couple examples to show how these differences work. In this match, we have Player 1's Sableye versus Player 2's Mankey deck. Now, if Sableye were to attack with Scratch, the attack does 20 damage. Mankey is weak to Psychic, so the damage would be doubled and Mankey would take 40 damage instead. Pretty simple, right? Now, if we switch out Sableye for Lucario V, we could attack with Aura Sphere to do 40 damage to Mankey and also 20 damage to the Primeape on Player 2's bench. But wait, Player 2 has a Manaphy on their bench that has the ability Water Veil, which prevents all damage from attacks done to the owner's benched Pokémon. So, because Lucario's Aura Sphere says it does 20 damage to the benched Pokémon, the ability would block it, protecting Player 2's bench. So let's switch back to Sableye. Now let's say Player 1 has 10 cards in their Lost Zone, so they can use the Lost Mine attack. It reads, put 12 damage counters on your opponent's Pokémon in any way you like. So this isn't dealing damage, it's instead placing damage counters. This would allow it to bypass Manaphy's ability, allowing Player 1 to put 6 damage counters onto Mankey and 6 damage counters onto their Primeape, knocking out both Pokémon. Now you'll notice that placing damage counters on the Mankey is not affected by weakness or resistance, so those counters would not be doubled. Now let's look at the same scenario, but this time, instead of Manaphy, Player 2 has a Rabsca with the ability Spherical Shield. It reads, prevent all damage from and effects of attacks from your opponent's Pokémon done to your benched Pokémon. So, Not only would that prevent Lucario V from doing 20 damage to one of Player 2's benched Pokemon, it would also prevent Sableye from placing damage counters onto the benched Pokemon because placing damage counters is an effect of the Lost Mine attack. And with that, now you know everything you need to play the Pokemon trading card game. Now, if you have any questions about the game or any other mechanics that come up, let me know in the comments below and I'll be happy to help. And don't forget to check if your local game store has a Pokemon League, where you can meet other Pokemon fans to battle and trade with and learn from. I'll put a link to the Pokemon event locator in the description below so you can find a Pokemon League near you. Thanks for watching.